Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversations is a podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. This third series of Nepal Conversations will focus on unpacking the status of social science research and teaching in Nepal.
For this episode of Nepal Conversations, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Neel Kamal Chapagain, who is an associate professor and director at the Center for Heritage Management at Ahmedabad University, India. Prior to joining Ahmedabad University, he taught at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, USA, as a full-time teaching faculty, and at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee as a doctoral teaching assistant. He obtained his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where his dissertation focused on rethinking cultural heritage conservation at traditional settlements. He also has an architecture doctorate and graduate certificate in historic preservation from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, a professional conservation course at ICCROM in Italy, and Bachelor of Architecture from Institute of Engineering, Tribhuvan University, Nepal. His professional journey spans Nepal, Bhutan, India, and the United States. Welcome to Nepal Conversation, Neel Kamalji. To begin with, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your academic journey, and your current research and teaching interest, and then we can build from there?
Thank you, Nimeshji and Umaji. My name is Neel Kamal. I am born and brought up in eastern Nepal, in Sunsari district. I started my schooling right there in the village in a government school. Came to Kathmandu later on for my undergraduate studies. Ventured out a little bit into science, then ended up in architecture at the Institute of Engineering. I must confess that I didn't have as much an idea about architecture when I joined. The joining was primarily it was the Institute of Engineering, and every student would aspire to either get into medicine or engineering. That was the reason. But for me, architecture was the choice because it was a new program being launched at that time. It was in 1995. And so thinking that a new subject might be interesting to explore, I sort of joined an undergraduate in architecture from Nepal. After a few years of work in Nepal, in Mustan, I got a fellowship at the East West Center in Hawaii. And that led me to do another degree in architecture, doctorate in architecture. And then while doing that, I had realized the importance of interdisciplinary studies. But since I was not prepared for that, I was pretty much relying on my own personal experience. Earlier working as an architect into conservation of old buildings in Upper Mustan, I had observed some issues about economic, social issues and all that. However, I was not so prepared to sort of ask those kind of questions. So my going to East West Center and University of Hawaii opened up a new way of thinking for me, which then further led me to think that I should also pursue a PhD, which I pursued at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And so I think the exposure to the US education allowed me to explore into anthropology, urban planning, even geography and other areas. And those, I think, culminated into some kind of a thinking which started from architecture, but then conservation architecture. Then I had some rethinking process going on in my journey as I was doing my research and thesis. Today, where I am is I am a faculty at Ahmedabad University in its Center for Heritage Management. So my teaching and research interests are now sort of in the domain of heritage management, which is a broad topic in itself, broad area. That's where I am.
Thank you so much for sharing your research journey with us, Neel Kamalji. As you shared, you've had a very adventurous career. Your original training was in architecture, not in social sciences, but you are now working on various issues of social science interest, such as participatory process, politics of heritage knowledge, and ethnography. What has been your experience of working as a cross-disciplinary scholar? What are the challenges and opportunities?
Let me again connect back to my journey. So one of the moment when I had some questions in my mind about our academic training was when in my school in the ninth standard, I think, we had to take some courses, and it was a kind of a trend that time that by default some of the students would put into science and math stream and some would go for history and economics and all that. I wondered at that time why I would not be allowed to study history and why I'm put into the science stream. So that's the kind of the academic background I grew up with. So when I, without any intention, when I ended up studying architecture, another question that was lurking in my mind was, as much as we're studying about the modern architecture, the steel, concrete, bricks, and all that, why didn't we talk about the architecture that I had seen in villages, the buildings built out of bamboo and that kind of vernacular materials? But I guess I was not trained to ask questions. So I kept those questions in my mind when I had to do a thesis in my final year of undergraduate architecture. All of a sudden I realized this is my opportunity to ask some questions and do some explorations. And that's what led me to venture out of the Kathmandu Valley and go out to Mustan. And I did my thesis there. And the primary reason of my thesis was to understand how people have been building with mud. Because so far we had not been taught about these vernacular materials. As I started studying mud architecture in Upper Mustan, based in Lomantan, I did my research for 2 months in that undergraduate thesis process. And what I realized was studying mud architecture was not just about architecture. It was actually part of kind of a cultural processes, rituals, kind of scientific processes involved within so-called unscientific ways that people would do things. So I think as much as I was learning and I was excited, I was exploring, I was also confused with my own education. And later on, after having my undergraduate degree, I was offered a job there to work in Upper Mustan as a conservation architect, and I happily accepted that. And while working that, I then realized more than the monuments and the old settlements that we're working on, there were very many issues which were not in my sort of expertise area. Like, I mean, these are related to economic issues and social issues and health issues and even political issues. For my graduate studies, I should go for economics because I felt without economic understanding, my work as a conservation architect was not going anywhere. So I think this is how I sort of was finding myself lost at times, or perhaps curious at another times between different disciplines. But I had no idea whether somebody could navigate. And this is where, again, when I had the fellowship to go to Hawaii, I think that did two things to me. One, I was exposed to other cultures as well. So that cross-cultural learning was in our hostel, in all the activities we were doing. But academically, the university culture in the US exposed to me sort of the idea of interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity. Then I realized, several issues that one could explore. And since then, I think I got hang of it. I'm just curious. For example, I used an ethnographic approach in my doctoral research, ventured out into urban planning and that kind of regional studies for my own expansion of architectural understanding of settlements. So I think gradually, I sort of gradually drawn into very many things, and I feel I'm getting better as a student, and I think that's where I am.
Thanks so much, NeelKamalji. I just wanted to maybe follow up on that to see what do you think is lacking in our education, higher education system in Nepal that kind of impedes or does not provide that kind of environment for us to explore our curiosities. What do you think is missing?
If I think back now, it is. I would say even we didn't have that foundation, because from the very early on, our education sort of molds us in a way that, okay, like this question of science versus economics for me at the very early on, I think that's where it sort of went wrong. That either we could have given choices, but even when there were choices, the choices were not really given. It was given like, okay, if you're a good student or seemingly good student, you would go for science, that kind of trend. But when you come to university, I think there is a missed opportunity, because unlike your school education, in university you had probably a little bit of opportunity of specialization, but also cross-fertilization of disciplines. We tend to put the students in silos. Like me having an architecture degree, even though I generated interest in, okay, maybe I should study economics later on, I couldn't figure out how that could happen. So I think the environment is completely missing. The mentoring is something I think lacking, and wherever there is mentoring in our programs, we tend to focus largely within the disciplinary bound. So if a history student is is doing good. I think the history student would not necessarily venture out into other disciplines. Perhaps, for example, our public service commission, the Lok Seva Ayog, could have been one opportunity where this could have been done in a real life sense, but I don't see that's happening. In higher education, certainly not, because the only reason I looked outside of Nepal for my higher education was for the master's degree and so on, is because in Nepal there was no follow-up degrees for architecture. That's the kind of mindset we came up with. So I think that's, in my mind, is something is a gap, and that needs to be challenged. I think it's changing now with the new institutions. I think the landscape has entirely changed. I'm talking 20 years ago scenario in Nepal. But really, I think it boils down to our systems, how our system, both formal and informal, has put a student into a kind of very narrow path without giving so much broader horizon to explore and think. And I think there is an automated process. You are a good student, you will go this track, and after this you will become this and that. So I think what today we call as a liberal education and interdisciplinary, I think that's somehow missing from that framework. The other, I think, which can be changed is really if our teachers, professors would actually look into students' interest, let them explore their passion, their interest. I think this could easily be changed. This is my reflection, looking back.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll come back to the question about opportunities and challenges later part of the conversation. But we want to switch gear a little bit to talk a little about your current research interest. And we had an opportunity to read one of your recent papers with Usa Nupane, titled Contextual Learning, Rethinking Education for Nepal in the Wake of COVID-19 Crisis. And this was published in Applied Science and Technology Annals. And we are curious to learn, we read it, but we are just want for our general audience, if you could tell a little bit about the general motivation behind this paper and what do you mean exactly, what do you mean by context-specific learning in this particular context?
Yes, thank you, Nimesi. I think that's a wonderful question because it sort of connects to what is going on in my mind right now as a faculty, as a teacher, but also as a parent, having a young kid at home. And Usa is my wife, so we wrote this paper together. And we none of us, both of us do not come from education background, so we have no background in this one. But it so happened that as I was sharing, my reflection of my own academic journey has been that I feel many times in my academic career, I missed out very good opportunities of learning. And those missing moments were missing to connect to the context. For example, I came from village and my education didn't really sort of connect back to my own village. It didn't allow me to take advantage of the farmers that were around me. Even my friends were, my parents were, my mom was a teacher and my father was a government employee. But even my friends who were, children of farmers, their education had nothing to do with what their family would be, running as a livelihood. And that's where I'm coming as a context-specific learning is what is education doing to us? Is it making us better based on or capitalizing on what we already have? Or is it making us a confused being looking for something that we don't know what we are looking for, where we are headed? I think particularly in my opinion, this is true to many kids who come from village, come to the cities for higher education and all that. I see, I can reflect back on my own life that as much as I was confused, I think still many people get confused. That's where I had this thinking that why can't education just help us become a better person, but also connect to our own context and perhaps make us somebody who can contribute back to the context. That's where it was coming. The motivation behind this particular paper you referred, which was published in the Applied Science and Technology by Recast, was this COVID-19. I think this is what I keep saying, that we were fortunate enough to live in this historic moment. Of course, it was painful, but one needs to also learn, one needs to reflect and move on. So in that positive spirit, particularly in my family, what happened was we just so happened to be separated from our kids. So my wife and me were in Nepal, and my parents and our son, they were stuck in India, and we were separated because the borders were closed, everything. So all of a sudden, overnight things so dramatically changed, and it paused. A very busy life. I would have traveled to at least few countries within those months, but so that pause, I took it as a moment of reflection, and that was the motive behind this particular paper. Not only we're reflecting on the family situation and all that, but also we are observing our own societies, um, from environmental issues to social issues to political issues. I think the COVID-19, particularly during those the first lockdown period for a few months, that was the context in which this paper was written. And the motivation for us was two things we were observing. One, the schools being closed, kids not being able to go to school, families forced to stay in home. It was creating a lot of issues which we were able to observe. But for us, the issue was we're separated. Family was separated across the border. But what was very exciting for us to observe was, well, just I think around 2 years before the pandemic, we had started homeschooling. I mean, we call it as an on-schooling rather, because we pulled out the kid from the school and we were sort of dealing at home. And that was primary motive was to, okay, can we experiment with education in a different manner so that you don't go by the textbook and the fixed idea of the subjects and this and that, but let the kid freely evolve, connecting to the context wherever he or she is in, and learn. Can that be a model? That is what we're experimenting. And what happened during the COVID lockdown was that um, our 10 years old son was able to manage his life, do so many things, and the confidence that he had, the crisis response that he was able to display, and all that made us feel confident that the kind of experiment we're doing in education at our own home and with our own family was worth. And this was the context and the motivation we felt we need to share. And Dr. Rameswar Adhikari, who was the editor of the journal, and he knew this story because we had in a meeting, we were together discussing the COVID issues, and this came up, and he encouraged that this must be shared. So that was the context that we wrote. But again, none of us have educational background, but it was sheer experience and the concerns about the education, both at the early childhood but also higher education. I think we sort of tried that way. So yeah, that's what was the story behind it.
Thank you so much. That's really an inspiring story experience of changing the difficulties that you faced personally into the kind of opportunities. Just to follow up on that, I was just thinking, do you think the COVID-19 situation was really affecting higher education sector in general as well? And also linking this personal experience with the work that you've been doing in higher education in Nepal and in India. Do you think COVID-19 and the crisis has opened up new opportunities to change the higher education sector, especially in the context of South Asia and Nepal? And if yes, what might be such opportunities?
I think yes, I strongly think COVID-19 not only made us pause and reflect, but it also really dramatically opened up this new avenues of education. Um, at least we felt at home that the context-based education that we were earlier talking has a much more role to play, because the kind of trauma, the psychological issues that many families went through, unfortunately having that difficult times for our family, education wise, I think we didn't suffer. We actually evolved out of that crisis. And the only reason I think we were able to handle that crisis was because we took education in a different approach, and I think that helped us. Now that I would like to connect to my work in India at Ahmedabad University, where I had the opportunity of designing a new program. And when I designed this program on heritage management, it is a graduate level program. I designed in a way that every student is responsible for his or her own learning. And the faculty would also need to connect the students on passion, his own context. And so in a way, context-based education was the sort of soul to this program also. And from early on, we had also used technology. We have done it both in classroom, out in field, all kinds of things. And just before COVID crisis, I remember having some conversations with colleagues in China, colleagues in Nepal as well, where whenever I couldn't be there in person, I would request, okay, let's just do a Skype. That was the thing at that time. And some would do, some would not do. And a drastic change was now with COVID, I was away from my university for 2 years. And I think I taught more than what I would have taught in the regular pace of, my academic journey. And I think that really made us realize the potential of the technologies that we have. And particularly with my work at Ahmedabad University, I think we were so prepared in a way without knowing that we could handle the crisis very easily. We ran everything online within a week or so, and we didn't compromise on the quality. I think, and this is where the pedagogy comes into picture, and that's what something I'm interested to explore these days to improve the quality of higher education. But on the other hand, in Nepal, I observed that. This online teaching became an issue. I also saw many colleagues experimenting with, running the lessons by telephone network, and many experiments were being done. But I think where it went well in India, at least in our university, and where it didn't work in some of the universities in Nepal, was, I think, this framework, the attitude that I mean, if you want to make an excuse, you would have enough excuse. You could say, oh, it's not available, it's not accessible to all the population and all that, and you can have data to support that. But if you want to turn the things around, you could actually think, how can this be enabled? I remember some of the colleagues in this think tank called Nepal Development Research Institute, NDRI. They were actually trying to help schools, even colleges, to break this barrier of haves and have-nots between the digital technology, access to internet and all that. And they were able to negotiate, and a lot of good work they did. But what apparently was lacking, because I was also privy to some of these efforts, was many times the teacher didn't have the attitude. Teacher were very hesitant, So I think, but then eventually they had no choice but to jump onto this movement that happened and really changed the world. I think some places it worked well, some places it didn't work, but and I would not say even at Ahmedabad University everything went well. I think there were also challenges we faced. But the lesson is you look at those challenges and improve it as you move forward. And I think really the opportunity that is opened up now is this hybrid mode of teaching. I think that is going to be the new mode. And I'm glad that in Nepal, at least some of the new university that is being planned, now the conversation is probably going in a hybrid mode. We have much more opportunities to tap into resources across the world. Even if somebody cannot travel, you could still have the lecture organized, interactions between students, students across institutes, across countries. Similarly, faculty sharing and all that are possible. So I think COVID-19, if one looks at it in a very positive spirit, not only has allowed us to think about our own preconceptions about who we are, how we do things, but also how we can exploit technology for improving our own teaching learning practices. I think these things have opened up very significantly. My only fear is, as a human being, I think this our collective memory has a very short span. And that's the only my fear. Otherwise, if all of us, put our minds together, I think COVID-19 crisis has taught us so much. We need to just capture those lessons and find new ways of doing things. And I wish, post COVID-19, we should not be really aiming for normal. This normal or new normal should actually not be the same normal as before. I think it should change. If we think that way, then I think there are a lot we can do together.
Yeah, the heritage management course that you mentioned really sounds interesting, and the collaborative teaching learning that you mentioned does seem like the way forward for higher education in the post-COVID world. In some of the work that you have published, we read about the way in which you draw attention to the role of traditional or indigenous knowledge as well. How do you see this relationship between traditional or indigenous knowledge and scientific or academic knowledge? Are they inherently different or even contradictory, or that there is a scope for complementarity?
To start with, I would say this was a new exploration I was doing as I started designing this program. And one of the things I had in my mind was the very idea of heritage needs to be expanded, needs to be challenged. And so that was one part. And as we were doing that, we sort of looked into multiple ways of doing it. And one of the ways we want to do it is, since heritage of any context is very grounded in that particular context, which is its physical context, but its environmental context, but also very cultural context, historic context. And how do we anchor heritage in those contexts? I think that for me, that's how the exploration started. So the traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge is something that is with the communities in whatever context they are in. And as one can see through history, the cultural studies people would also understand this, that over the centuries, from generations to generations, many things evolve. So there is this immense resource, knowledge, skills, lifestyle, and then eventually what we call as heritage evolve in that process. So for us, this notion of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge is a way to look at this invisible richness that any society, any context has, and how can we look into that so that we have a deeper understanding of heritage. I think that's where I started. And later on, as we were talking earlier about contextual education, this is where I connected the broad idea of education to a context, that every context has its own repository of knowledges. And unless the education process taps into that knowledge, the education probably cannot be very useful to the respective context. So this is where broadly from the heritage to the education I was coming. And this is where I think currently I'm focusing at. So the opportunity this provides is, again, something I mentioned earlier. Um, if there is a village and the primary occupation in the village is the farming, you would notice that, the villagers would have evolved over the course of generations, their way of looking at the land, looking at the weather pattern, the rainfall patterns, even the flow of river, all the natural resources, including the movement of animals, the plantation, everything. So they would have gathered all this information. And if you look at, let's say, a village in which majority of people are into farming, then the idea of indigenous knowledge or community knowledge or traditional knowledge would allow us to look at these farmers as the repository of the indigenous knowledge, in which not only they have advanced their understanding of farming, the process of farming, the skills and all that, but actually doing that, they have actually mastered so many other disciplines, like how do you understand weather? How do you understand the landscape? How do you frame your lifestyle in that seasonal patterns of the year? How do you even respond to the natural resources like river? How do you manage your relations with the wildlife or your domestic cattle and all that? So much very entangled systems are there, which we can call it ecosystem, and that's what I refer as the indigenous knowledge systems, and that's very rich. And I think at least our part of the world needs to capitalize on that. And in my work in India, luckily, I have been able to anchor our program into some of these communities where, for example, in the state of Gujarat, there are specific communities which are very well known for camel breeding. There is another community which are known for buffalo breeding. There are communities which are known for certain kind of farming. Some other community have expertise on water management. So we study these things as a part of our learning process. So we go to villages, spend time there, and learn. So as much as this professional program is able to learn from these uh, you know communities in different contexts, I think the lens of interdisciplinarity allows us to connect to multiple disciplines, and the hope in our program is that, okay, that way probably the next generation of heritage professionals are much more grounded into the context. So whatever they come up with as a solution would be responsible to the specific context, and they will help. I think this is the way this program is going. And if I connect it to the early education, child education or school education, this is where, in fact, we had done a little bit of experiment on that also, where one can teach science, math, history, social science, all kinds of subjects that one would study in school by looking into this context. And that actually could be a foundation of the cross-disciplinary education or interdisciplinary education that you earlier mentioned. But really the challenge is in our very foundation of education, we have missed that. We start by drawing the boundaries across subjects, disciplines, And I think that's that we miss. So in some ways, the idea of indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, as much as it is a knowledge in itself and it is very powerful, it also allows us to, from the very beginning, break those boundaries. I think that's the opportunity it has. Now, when I say that, there is by default, there is a counterpart there. Okay, the modern knowledge or the scientific knowledge. And my take on that is, these are different knowledge systems. In fact, you may have seen this paper I published through ICCROM. There was this international forum in which we are looking at different countries and we're looking at cases and analyzing. In that, actually, I looked it up differently. I looked at some of the traditional knowledge systems in Nepal, for example, the Guti system in Kathmandu Valley, or the mud architecture system in Upper Mustang. That was my research. I looked at those, and then I tried to think of how can we bridge between these so seemingly, um, counter arguments of modern knowledge systems versus the traditional knowledge systems. And what I realized was actually they are not necessarily um, sort of opposed to each other. They could very well be complementing each other. Then so I try to propose a framework in which I argue that what we need to do is understand from which context these knowledge systems are evolving. So eventually, I call them as part of contemporary knowledge systems, in which you have scientific knowledge systems. Within the scientific knowledge systems, also you may have different disciplinary knowledge systems, which have its own ecosystems. On the other hand, in the informal systems, like the grounded, the farming knowledge and others, you may also have various threads of knowledge systems coming. So when you start seeing these knowledges as part of an ecosystem, whether in the urban context or the rural context, you start realizing that all of these are very dynamic process, what we call as a living heritage. And they always change, they keep evolving, they keep addressing the challenges and evolve in a different form. And what that reminds us is none of this knowledge, it's like a scientific process. You have a hypothesis, and hypothesis is true until it is falsified, right? Same thing would apply into the traditional knowledge also, that we need not romanticize them as by saying they are the perfect ones. They always keep improving. And when you have this framework, then you actually start saying that these two seemingly different knowledge systems actually start complementing each other. And that was the framework that I sort of proposed in that meeting. And that's what I discuss in my class also, and to some extent it's helpful. So I think it's not about they being in opposition, it's about where they are coming from, and what are they able to address, what are they not able to address. And then when you look at the areas that are not being able to address, or the challenges, then you look for, okay, can I draw lessons from the traditional system or the modern systems? And I think if we go that way, it would sort of address those challenges, and eventually it become part of the contemporary knowledge systems. I think that's how I look at it. But I have to have a disclaimer here that this is still my ongoing work. I'm still trying to explore more. I'm now looking into the context of Nepal also, particularly in the mountain ecosystem, to understand it better and see how it helps us to improve our educational systems, but also some of the professional practices like the engineering practices or even architectural practices. This is where I'm at currently, looking at as my research interest.
Thanks, Neel Kamal ji. That was really interesting. I particularly like your point about knowledge as ecosystem, and also the risk of romanticizing sort of indigenous local knowledge. That's really interesting. We've come towards the end of the conversation now, and so we want to go back a little bit to your point about interdisciplinarity, and given your diverse experience in training, working in higher education sector, both in the global south and global north, and particularly with your current experience of working in the academic sector in India. We don't hear much about Nepali scholars who are based in the Indian academic sector, but you continue to work in Nepal, collaborate with Nepali scholars. So maybe you could tell a little bit about where do you see Nepal's higher education sector in terms of future opportunities and challenges, given your diverse experiences. If you could shed light into that, and we can end there.
It is certainly very different than what I personally went through, and therefore some of the comments I made earlier probably would not make sense to anybody who is going through the education system today in Nepal. So I'll have to sort of make that point that some of my comments may not be relevant. But having worked in India for past 8 years now, what I realized is because the context of India and Nepal are so comparable, but the way India is progressing in higher education, I think there are some lessons we could learn because they are the immediate neighbors and socioculturally we are very close. One of the things I observed is the attitude again to make higher education um, as a way to experiment, as a way to do innovation, in a way, being socially responsible. And what that means is instead of thinking education as just for the sake of certificates and getting a job, if there are higher ambition embedded in the education system, I think it's a different story. And I think in my recent conversation with some of the colleagues in Nepal, I have started observing that in Nepal also that has started happening. The second thing I would highlight is we need to also think about the governance in our higher education. I think that's a serious thing to think in Nepal. If I give you an example, Tribhuvan University and other universities in Nepal, if by default we end up having earlier it used to be the king, now the prime minister became the chancellor of the university, I think we have a big issue there. That's my personal opinion, and we need to change that. So by governance I mean the academics need to have their own governance system free of other social governance system. I think that autonomy in governance needs to be there in higher education. That's a must in my opinion, because that really motivates, enables the academicians to do their job properly. Having said that, I would also say the third point would be that academicians also need to be sincere about their own responsibilities. In Kathmandu, there is a very there are terms used to indicate, how people just take teaching as a sake of teaching as a job, and really just, it becomes a repetitive job where you just go and repeat the same content again and again. I think that's changing very rapidly in Nepal. It needs to change even rapidly to ensure that teaching is not just teaching. Teaching is backed up by research. So there should be no teacher should be without research. I think that's something we have to drive. And what do we consider as research? The research methodology. How does our research connect to our own context and be responsible? I think that's another thing we should think. And again, in India, I have started seeing at least some universities which are really coming up aggressively on that. And what that means is, the faculty needs to be given. So there are these kind of steps that higher education system can go. But I think there is also equally important part on the parents or the society as a whole, where what is the objective of education? Why we send our kids to school or colleges? I think that needs to be discussed at a much larger societal context, because I think the purpose of education needs to be rethought in the context of Nepal. Because not knowing why we have to go for educational process, I think we are lost, and we are doing just either, just following a blind faith. I think that's also not fair. But the positive side I'm seeing now is um, many, Nepalis are all over the world doing wonderful job, like, both of you also in academia in UK. So I think that's a good prospect that now any good university you go, you'll find at least one Nepali as a faculty, few Nepali as a student, and probably the number will be just higher in some of the institutions. I think that's a big opportunity. And also many Nepali, anybody you speak outside of Nepal or inside Nepal, there is this burning desire to contribute to improve our education system. So I think that's a big opportunity, and somebody needs to tap into it. Maybe we need to, again, I will emphasize on collaboration. I will emphasize on open-mindedness. I will emphasize on letting go of our personal and professional egos, and think that, okay, I'm an architect, but what can I learn from a sociologist? Or, I'm an architect, or I'm a scientist, and I studied science because that's what my teacher suggested, and my colleague who went to study history because he didn't have as much good marks as mine. That kind of things are, so, but I think we need to move beyond that and see what do we learn from each other. So that's only then this notion of interdisciplinarity can be practiced. So theory is one thing, but I think we need to put into practice. But in Nepal, I must say, whether you look into every sector, whether it's arts, whether it's creative arts, whether it's literature, science. There are very young institutions being founded in Kathmandu and elsewhere, where a lot of good research are happening. New educational institutions are coming up where many, like the liberal education and all that are already being practiced. I think Nepal's education landscape has really changed. One needs to recognize that rather than just complaining and sort of blaming each other. I think there is a lot of opportunities. Only word of caution I would say at the end is, yes, I think we're all going elsewhere, getting trained and coming back and doing. We perhaps need to also think, okay, rather than just bringing whatever we learned exactly and try to apply in Nepal, we need to also go through a thinking process to contextualize. And this is where, again, the contextual education comes again as a concept that when we design new education system for Nepal, probably we need to contextualize for our own context and take our graduates, take our students through a thinking process. I think critical thinking, contextual thinking, these are some of the traits that we must try to have in our systems. I think it's a high time, if not already late, to think in this line. And I'm really happy that it's already, it has started to happen in Nepal, new institutions coming up. And a lot of collaborations across global north, global south happening. So I think I'm very hopeful for the future of higher education in Nepal.
Thank you, Neel Kamalji. Thank you for ending on that really positive and inspiring note. And thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Thanks. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.